Community Ecology and Ecosystem Services. Section 1, Ecosystem Change. It's important to remember that ecosystems are constantly changing, even without any human impact. Scientists used to think there was a climax community or an apex community where ecosystems would change and then they'd reach this top, stable, perfect ecosystem. And then anything that happened after that, like a fire or a flood, was something bad that was happening to that community. But scientists now realize that things are constantly changing. There's no apex community, a top-tier community. Things are always changing. When we look at what is a community, an ecological community, they're defined by the species composition found within that ecosystem. And that species composition looks at three things: the species that are present, the combination or mix of those species present, and the relative abundance of members of those species. So how many of each species do you have? That defines your ecological community in a region. Abiotic factors in a region, basically your soil plus your climate, determines what type of community you'll have in a region. The term trophic cascade is what happens when you have a top-tier predator that impacts multiple different trophic levels, not just what it feeds on below it, but even the producers below that. So that's a trophic cascade. When you change something with your apex predator, your top-tier tertiary predators, what happens to multiple layers of your food web below that tertiary predator. Severe disturbances in an ecosystem, flooding, volcanic eruptions, tornadoes, fire, human impact, all of those are pretty severe disturbances. More kind of gentle disturbances, maybe heavy rains, wind, some mild human impact like some camping or off-roading, those type of things. After a disturbance, the process of ecological succession happens. Ecological succession is this very predictable kind of change in species composition of an ecosystem as time passes after a disturbance, whether it's a mild disturbance or a very severe disturbance. So our two types of succession, section 2 in your notes, our first type of ecological succession is primary succession. Primary succession is succession that happens without soil. So on like bare rock, right after a volcanic eruption where you've got lava, after you've left a parking lot. So the key to primary succession is bare rock, no soil, okay? So after you've got this bare soil, or bare rock, excuse me, this no soil, you're first going to have early successional species come in. Those early successional species are species that can break down your rock or your parking lot. So you're looking at bacteria, you're looking at your lichens, those type of mosses, those type of things. Once your lichens and your mosses will chemically weather the rock. It will break the rock down into smaller chunks. So you have smaller pieces of your hard substrate. Then those lichens and mosses will die, and in their death they add organic matter to those smaller little chunks of rock. So you're adding your organics and your smaller particles of rock to form soil. Lichens and mosses facilitate other plants' growth. So those organisms are called facilitators. A facilitator organism is any organism within the process of an ecosystem or ecological succession that allow other species to grow better. Once you have your soil, then you're going to start to have your grasses, your smaller plants, basically anything usually that's wind dispersed type seeds will start growing. Also animal poo dispersed seeds will start growing as well. So you have those things come in, you have smaller grasses, those type of things. Once those plants die, they further enrich the soil and you can have bigger things grow like trees. So your trees aren't going to start growing right away because the soil at that point is very, very thin. So after decades of your smaller plants, your grasses dying, adding more organic matter to the soil, then you'll start having enough of a soil base where you can start having trees and other late successional species. So what type of species do you have with succession? So in the Midwest, we tend to have grasslands. In the east, we tend to end up eventually with forests, and in the southwest, we tend to end up with shrubland. Again, Those regional differences in our long-term successional communities depend a lot on climate, how much rain you get, what's the temperature, okay? Interference is also another term. So we have facilitators that help other organisms grow or live, and we have interference, which are organisms that cause other organisms to not be successful. Classic example of interference are actually trees. Trees block out the sun, and many organisms, and many plant organisms, cannot grow underneath those trees because the trees are interfering with the suitability of the habitat for other plants. Okay, section 3, secondary succession. So primary succession, organisms begin from no soil. Secondary succession, soil. So you've got soil for secondary succession. So you're going to have a disturbance that will wipe out the animal and plant communities, but not the soil. Primary, classic examples of secondary succession disturbance events, forest fires. So you'll wipe out all the trees, but the soil is still there. Hurricanes, a lot of times, if they're going to be strong, they'll wipe out all your marsh plants, but the soil will still be there. Tornadoes. All three of those are really great examples of disturbances that will completely remove your animal and plant habitat community, but will leave the soil, okay? So you have, again, you're starting with soil, so you generally don't start with lichens and mosses this time. Usually you'll start with your grasses, your plants, things that can tolerate full sun, and then you'll get some more trees eventually once you get your soil enriched with some of the organic matter from the dying grasses. Pioneer species of trees, aspen and cherry, are pioneer species of trees. They're called pioneer species because they do well in full sun, and they can do well with nutrient-poor soil. So you have pioneer species of trees before you have full forests develop. Species that do well in shade, such as beech and maple trees, will eventually grow once you've got kind of your pioneer species that have provided some shade, and they are able to actually outcompete some of your pioneer tree species. Okay, section 4, ecosystem services. An ecosystem service is any product, resource, or service produced or provided by the environment by an intact, functioning ecosystem. So it's something that provides value to us as humans by having a fully functional and intact ecosystem. How do we know if an ecosystem is fully intact and functioning? Generally, it has high biodiversity, which we'll talk about next unit, or a very rich and diverse ecological community. There are 4 categories of ecosystem services: provisioning services, regulating services, supporting services, and cultural services. It's not important that you memorize these 4 categories. These 4 categories are just used to kind of differentiate the different type of services. You're definitely going to need to know some good, like 3 or 4 good examples of services, but you don't have to memorize the categories. So a provisioning service is something that provides humanity with provisions, and provision means to supply with food, drink, or equipment, especially for a journey. So how do intact ecosystems provide us with sustenance, basically? So food production, obviously. Intact ecosystems will provide wild berries, opportunities for hunting of game animals, medicines. That's probably one of the most important provisioning services of a very biodiverse ecosystem, is that you can find all kinds of different plant compounds. About 1/4 of our pharmaceuticals on the market are derived from chemicals from rainforest plants. So it's a very important and lucrative ecosystem service for us, the pharmaceutical industry. Okay, regulating services are ways the environment kind of keeps things clean for us and healthy and detoxified. So carbon sequestration, we did a whole lab on that. That's a huge, important function of biodiverse ecosystems. Climate regulation, trees provide shade, bodies of water provide temperature moderation. We saw what happened when the Aral Sea dried up, and the temperature moderation and environmental health of the people that lived around the environment, or the Aral Sea. A lot of times things will be detoxified in the environment, so heavy metals, wetlands will break down a lot of our nitrates and our biological wastes. And then water supply. We talked a lot in Unit 1 about aquifer recharge. So having open land areas that do not have impervious cover, that have that regular ground, is critically important for our aquifer recharge. Supporting services are ways in which the environment supports life on Earth, which are sort of not very evident. So nutrient cycling is a big one in supporting services and soil health, as well as some of our plant services like seed dispersal and primary production. Disturbance control is a really important ecosystem services. Wetlands are critically important when we have hurricanes and stuff come in. A lot of times when we have floods, wetlands are able to absorb some of the water or the brunt of some of our storm surges from hurricanes. Very, very important. And then cultural services are ways in which the environment enhances our day-to-day life on an intellectual or cultural level. So examples like you go camping, you go hiking, you have ecosystems for scientific discovery. And a lot of times people think like, oh, cultural service, how pretty things look. That's very frou-frou. But there's a major industry in the US that depends on aesthetic beauty for billions of dollars of economics every year. That industry? Real estate. What's the big word in real estate? Location, location, location. You can get way more money for your house if it overlooks a lake than if it overlooks a landfill. So that ecosystem service of cultural and aesthetic beauty provides billions of dollars in revenue each year in the real estate industry. So before you kind of dismiss the idea of pretty ecosystems, like, oh, that's kind of frou-frou, that's pretty much the underpinning of a lot of real estate is, do you have homes near very beautiful scenic areas, or do you have homes near, you know, waste dumps or highways, that type of thing. Another case study with ecosystem services, the Catskill Mountain Reservoir purifies that watershed, purifies in a natural way with very minimal processing the water that goes into the reservoirs that New York City depends on. Very interesting case study. New York City noticed they started having poorer and poorer water quality, and they're like, what's happening? And they did a land use survey, and they noticed a lot of the areas that recharged their reservoirs started to have a lot more agricultural use with pesticides and nutrients, nitrogen-based fertilizers primarily, as well as some more impervious cover, that type of thing. And water quality decreased to the point that New York City was going to have to build $7 billion worth of water treatment in a reservoir that did not need it previously. So they thought a little bit, and they decided that they were going to look at the ecosystem service provided by the natural watershed into their reservoir instead of trying to build treatment plants. So, and the annual operating cost was going to be $300 billion. So $7 billion outlay for the treatment plants, $300 million a year to run them. Instead, what they did is the New York City watershed kind of bureau invested $1.5 billion in land protection. They reforested a bunch of areas. They did some sewage treatment work in some of the smaller towns up in the Catskill region in New York, and all this was completed in 2006. It was called their New York City Long-Term Watershed Protection Plan. Their water, again, completely exceeds EPA standards, and they didn't have to build any of that $7 billion and $300 million a year water treatment. Why? Because they took care of the ecosystem that was for free, purifying the water that went into their reservoirs. It was a smart move on New York City's part. Another case study, ecotourism is incredibly economically valuable in many countries in the world. Costa Rica, a prime example. They, in the 1970s, made a very conscientious decision by their government at the time to preserve a lot of their land. About 25% of Costa Rica is preserved in national parks. And that wasn't what it was in 1970, but they decided that they had a national treasure, and they do. Costa Rica has some of the highest biodiversity, per hectare in the world. And they said, hey, this is unique. People will come to see it, but we have to protect it, and that's what they did. And today, about 5.5% of GDP is ecotourism driven, which equates to $2.15 billion a year for their economy. So it was a smart move. An ecosystem service, that's a big ecosystem service, ecotourism. If you can preserve your land, your intact, functioning, biodiverse ecosystems, people will come to pay to come to see them. Okay, thank you.